Right, mate, that's 6 o'clock, so we will start the meeting. So the first thing is to ask for live stream to be turned on, please. Sorry, that's on, is it? You'll have to excuse me tonight again. I've got a bright light here and it is quite dim out there, as you know, so I'll try and recognise you and see you, but I apologise if I give you the wrong name or don't see you at first. So, welcome members and the public to the council meeting, which resumes the meeting which began on Tuesday, the 6th of July, and was adjourned at 10:30 p.m. Only the outstanding item of business listed on the agenda will be considered this evening. The meeting tonight is being held in Caudle Hall at the Wilford Noyce Community Centre, as it is not possible for the full council to meet together in the council chamber at the council offices, whilst maintaining appropriate social distancing to reduce the risk of COVID infection. And this is government legislation, which is why we do it. Councillors are supported this evening by the Chief Executive, Tom Horwood, Strategic Director, Graham Clark, the Borough Solicitor, Daniel Bainbridge, David Maycock, Employment Director at South East Employers, and the Democratic Services and Business Support Team Manager, Louise Fleming. Members, please raise your hand to indicate that you wish to speak, and you will be operating your own microphones. As you heard from the test, they do seem to work quite well. I can also confirm that we are live streaming the event this evening. We are again in an unfamiliar setting, so I'd like to ask members for their patience this evening. Speeches will be timed, and you'll be given a 30-second warning before your time is up. Finally, I will waive the requirement to stand when speaking, and you may remain seated or stand if you wish. So item 9, minutes of the executive. So may I please continue with this and ask the statement on the part 2 minutes. And first of all, Councillor Mary Forashevsky, Mental Health.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I had no idea I was going to be on so soon, but thank you very much. And can I just start by saying that I would like to thank the leader and the executive, and I would also like to thank the former leader, Councillor Ward, for taking on board and actually following through with what I put a little bit of pressure on you, and you came through. So thank you so much. I would like to thank you for having the courage to take on board a subject that's hard to talk about, a subject that's sensitive, and a subject that in so many occasions is tragic. I watched the executive meeting in June, but unfortunately I couldn't be there. Councillor Follows and Rosamond summed up beautifully that this was the start of the beginning. Now we have an opportunity to shape it, but it was always important that there was a starting point, and that starting point was to get the mental health strategy onto the agenda. Some of the comments made, and I reference Councillor Hyman, who I have a great deal of respect for. I get what you were saying, but we were not talking about taking the place of professionals or clinicians. We were talking about taking part in something that is really critical and really current and really important, that we are all aware, and we have taken a very constructive approach, in my opinion. Councillor Baker, I've been in touch with you and I completely understand where you were coming from in your comments, but now is the time for your input, and I hope that we can catch up soon to talk more. I'm looking forward to catching up with you, because I believe you have masses to contribute to this based on your very personal experience, of which I commend you for your courage speaking so openly about it. I've been shocked and surprised by the amount of people who've already contacted me. I'd like to mention one particular lady called Lucy Bushell from Cranley Sunflowers. She sent me an inspiring letter full of great ideas of how she could help. But now we have a strategy, we now must make it work. Surrey County Council and Waverley are involved in Pride in Surrey in holding an event on the 25th of September. It's going to take place in Godalming. I've already spoken to the organisers, and I hope with the portfolio holder for economic development we can do something there to make some formal sort of launch. I can't let this moment go, though, without finally just saying thank you. Thank you to all the members of this council and to the staff, to Kevin Denis, who allowed me to get this onto the agenda in the first place. to all the members of Health and Wellbeing ONS, to officers Mark Mills and to Councillor Baker, Ned's mom, Jo Marsden, the brilliant Jess Wicks and Henry Askerley, members of this campaign at the very start, Henry of which is an employee of Waverley Borough Council. But above all, to Louise Knorr, who was instrumental in bringing the suicide prevention strategy on the agenda and making it go forward. But I would just like to end by saying Christine Baker, Jo Marsden, and all those who have shared their stories and all those who are affected by suicide, this is for you. So thank you very much, and for this council for putting a very sensitive subject on the agenda into the corporate strategy for us to actually make a difference to the wider community. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Councillor Moroszewski. I now move on, please. I have 3 questions now, all from Councillor Jerry Hyman. His first statement is on the mental health. So, Councillor Hyman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I don't know whether members realise that this should have been covered on the 6th of July Council when we were at the Maltings, but because the meeting was running very late, the minutes of the executive were not done. I very much doubt if many people here have got any committee papers with them or anything to refer to. When I indicated to speak on these items, it was simply because there were a number of items covered on the agenda at the executive, which were either for noting or were certainly in front of us at a council meeting, and it would look very odd indeed if no one said anything at all about them. I didn't want to hold the meeting up, so I'd spoken to committee services in advance and said that I would simply refer people back to the 24th of June executive meeting, which was where those had gone through, because we had covered them at some length, as Councillor Moroszewski has alluded. In respect to the suicide prevention plan, Councillor Moroszewski's admirable initiative during her mayorable year, I think was appreciated by everybody, and you know, the comments that I made in respect of the suicide prevention plan was nothing to do with you know, what we should, our own personal attitudes towards suicide and our own experiences of family and friends and other loved ones. It's a matter of what we as a council should be doing and how far we should be going. And my particular comment in this respect was that our actual suicide prevention plan, the one thing that it does, if members probably don't have Annex 2 to the to agenda item 10 to the executive of 24th June in front of them, but I do. It says workforce development, ensure that percentage staff trained in 6 steps to wellbeing. It says percentage staff trained in basic mental health awareness, and ensure percentage staff trained in mental health first aid or equivalent. That is our plan, but it doesn't tell us what percentage it is, and it doesn't tell us what the cost's going to be if we're paying for expertise or anything like that. So although this was adopted by the executive without any percentages in there, as that is the one action that we're doing other than keeping track of data, I think we really do need to put some percentages in front of that and bring it back to us so that we can approve it properly, because at the moment, without knowing how many of our staff, whatever we do intend to train in this and what the cost is likely to be, we haven't really done anything in adopting it. So that's all I'd like to say on that item. Could you remind me?
Thank you then, Councillor Hyman. You now got your next subject then presenting, which is Take the Jump.
Yes, thank you. The Take the Jump initiative, which was something which was suddenly sprung upon us. There was no way that anybody had an opportunity to look at it in advance and see what was actually being doing. We are giving our residents a steer, telling them that we expect them to participate. Take the leap would be a nice thing to call it, rather than take the jump, particularly when it was on the agenda that it was on. I think where we're saying to people, keep things for 7 years, where we're saying to people only buy 3 or 4 items of clothing a year and only a holiday once every 3 years, I mean, if we're going to be that specific with people as though that is going to be the solution to all our problems, then really, we shouldn't be getting involved in this sort of thing. As our residents do not want us telling them that they've got to have more holidays and that'll save the planet. It's me, I don't take a holiday every 3 years on an aeroplane. I don't doubt many, that is more than half the population do. So the majority of people, it's just being silly. And even at the meeting, members of the executive themselves we're talking about, for instance, doing a deal with a member of their family to so that they could have their clothing allowance and that sort of thing. If we're not going to take this seriously, then we're not going to show leadership. And this is about community leadership. If we are going to be community leaders that I think that we should or either do aspire to, or that we have by being elected councillors, then we should all be doing it ourselves. But how many people in this room are going to be buying 3 or 4 items of clothing a year, deciding I'm not going to, but I can't buy that, I've already had my quota, or keeping things for 7 years, regardless of whether it's a banana or a car or whatever. I mean, the advice that we're asking people to follow, unless we can lead by example and do, I think really it's meaningless and it's virtue signalling. And I really don't think this council should be virtue signalling. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Now your third statement is capital projects.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, there are some items on capital projects there. In the past, when we got a budget book back in sort of January, February of each year, it was full of the sort of like data sheets or sheets which showed us how each of the capital projects had gone through the system, why there was justification for it, and it was all agreed at the budget. What we see now is that we've got a list in front of us. No, it hasn't been in front of executive. There are a few items on there. I won't pick out any other than, for instance, Farnham Park cycle paths through Farnham Park. There are a lot of, we're going to be spending money on a number of items which are, and we're talking about 30, 40, 50,000 pounds a time on feasibility studies, when frankly we should look at the feasibility studies we've already done and look at the law and look at what we ought to be doing, I think, putting these before scrutiny, before we decide we're going to spend money on these feasibility studies. We shouldn't reinvent the wheel when we've already looked at these before. So I would ask the leader if he would confirm that before we go ahead spending money on feasibility studies, members are allowed to look at them just to make sure we're not wasting another 40, 50 grand over and over again every few years on feasibility studies that get binned for the sake of another initiative in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Now, I would ask the members, please, the council to agree to receive and note the minutes. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. There are no further matters to be considered, and therefore the reconvened meeting is concluded, and we'll now proceed to the council meeting scheduled for this evening. So the first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. So if I could ask Louise Fleming to report any apologies, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Apologies for absence have been received from councillors Kevin Denis, Simon Deere, Brian Edmonds, George Hess, Anna James, Jackie Keane, Robert Knowles, Michaela Martin, Penny Rivers, Richard Seaborn, Liz Townsend and George Wilson.
Thank you. Louise, are there any declarations of interest prior to the meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Chief Executive has a personal interest in respect of item 7, local government collaboration update, due to the HR implications set out in the exempt annexes, and will leave the meeting during the consideration of this item.
Thank you. So item 3 is the Mayor's announcements. I promise I won't take long with these tonight. I'm feeling quite warm in here anyway, and I'm sure Mary understands why. It's a real pleasure to be able to leave isolation and return to the community. I have seen invitation to events slowly rising since the last council in July. Now, Jackie is Deputy Mayor of Haslemere, and I attended the Inspector Donaldson Memorial at Haslemere. For those of you who didn't know, Inspector Donaldson was the first Surrey police officer murdered on duty on the 29th of July, 1855. He's buried at St Bart's, and it happened following a brawl at the King's Arms. Now, I've also been invited to open a refurbished and renamed Cranley Hotel, which stands in Cranley, although it's spelt in the old way rather than the new way. And it was a pleasant evening when I went over there and cut a ribbon. And there will be pictures showing me cutting this ribbon. I don't often cut ribbons, but I did that evening. On Sunday, Jackie and I were invited by their president, David Gill, to Rowledge Cricket Club for their President's Day. Unfortunately, it rained, so the cricket was abandoned after 32 overs. Some of you may well remember David as an energetic officer at Waverley. I certainly worked with him when I was here in 2003, 2007. This particular club is going from strength to strength, producing players from youth to adults. In fact, one of their ladies was on television the other night playing in the new 100 Ball League. So it's a very vibrant club, and I recognise that they are really bringing young people forward and getting them a career in cricket, or indeed a hobby, but using their energy in the way it should be used. In the middle of July, we heard on the news about the floods in Germany. I was saddened to hear that our twin town of Mayence-Comblenz was affected. On behalf of Waverley, I sent a message of condolence and support to the Landrat, Dr. Alexander Saftig. I've not heard back yet as to the damage or any particular injuries. I'll finish with saying that I would like to thank all the NHS staff and volunteers, all those that are local that have been involved in the vaccination programme that are leading us out of this tragic pandemic into a more normal life, and for the support from Waverley officers in making sure that we can continue to properly function as a working borough. Thank you. So we'll now move on to the leader's announcements. So if I could invite the leader, Councillor Follows, please, to make any announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, members. I just want to start very quickly by saying thank you to our officers for getting the venue set up for us today. Certainly, under the circumstances we're in, to get this venue ready and set up for us all to safely operate is a fantastic achievement. And so thank you. And also, I can't let this opportunity go to say thank you to the Godalming Town Council officers. This is actually right in the snap centre of mine and Councillor Rosamond's ward in central Godalming, and the community centre of Godalming Town Council. And I think it's a very good venue for us here today. So thank you to them too. The only thing I'm really going to talk about very briefly tonight is in discussion, in response to some discussion some members have been discussing by email regarding councillors being present at meetings and officers being present at meetings. So councillors have to be present by law and officers do not. Many of us obviously find that law pretty ridiculous and have said so on many occasions, but at present it is what it is. Now, most businesses are still having some form of internal rules as a result of their local COVID risk assessments. Now, at Waverley, we're no different, and at present, staff are still being asked to work from home if they're able to do so. Now, as you can see by tonight's session, when required, officers are attending formal meetings in person. And it's clear that for certain types of committees, and as many of you will have seen some of the more recent planning committees are the most obvious that leap to my mind right now, that a greater officer presence for support of those meetings is probably required. And I just wanted to right now, not just remind people of why officers aren't here and why we are, but also to reassure members that we will respond to concerns raised for things like Western Planning the other day, where there was insufficient officer support in the room when the technology was unable to facilitate that meeting effectively. I'm now going to hand over with the Mayor's indulgence to Councillor Peter Clark.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members will be aware that since councillors have returned to face-to-face committee meetings held in the council chamber, there have been some sound quality issues at some of the hybrid meetings. At the recent Western Planning Committee, these issues came to the fore. Unfortunately, these problems don't all have one simple fix. Many of them are down to the local connectivity issues with the individual participants using Zoom. Going forward, we will be asking these participants to log in 15 minutes ahead of the meetings to test the quality of their connections. However, the main cause we have been investigating is the interface between the chamber sound equipment to Zoom and YouTube. One of our IT staff has been working with the contractor that installed the Zoom equipment to replace the component that passes the sound from the chamber system to Zoom YouTube. This work has just been completed and the system has been tested. The true test, of course, will be using it for the next hybrid meeting. In the event that these issues do continue, the other solution is to connect the Zoom PC in the chamber to our broadband via a wired connection rather than using Wi-Fi as it does at present. Our contractors have surveyed the cable run required to get a point from the equipment in the chamber back to the required broadband network switch, and it is likely to be a fibre optic cable rather than copper connection due to the length of the run. So in summary, if the sound component replacement has not improved the sound quality issue, we will commission the fibre optic cabling. So finally, just to ensure members that we are on top of the situation and hopefully things will be working perfectly soon. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, members. Briefly, first on Brightwells. The build of the Brightwell scheme is still proceeding well despite a few delays. Chris Nicholson expect the first of the flats to be occupied before the end of this year, and they say there's a lot of interest in the residential side of the scheme, and that will take us something like an 18 months to 2 year period to become fully built and fully occupied. In terms of the commercial side of the scheme, that will now open sometime early next year. And Crest again and Surrey tell us there's a lot of interest from retailers to come into the scheme. They say that Farnham is standing up well despite the problems of the pandemic and despite the move to online shopping, and they're confident that they'll be able to get appropriate tenants for the scheme. Turning to planning, the first thing I'd like to mention is that we do have a problem, as I think most of us will understand, with our 5-year housing supply. An inspector decided at a recent large planning application in Farnham that we don't have a 5-year housing supply. The developer claimed that our housing supply was only 3.78 years, but the planning inspector decided to almost cut the average between our view and the developer's view, and that we have 4.26 years housing land supply. Now, this is a considerable problem in that if you don't have a land supply, you're in a weaker position to defend against appeals. And all that we can do is talk to developers, and we're doing that. The planning policy team is doing that. We're reviewing all the developments out there. But the basic problem is, we all know, is that the developers not building the applications and not building them fast enough. The chief executive recently wrote to Jeremy Hunt to point this out. It's essentially a national problem, it's a government problem, but we will continue to do our best in the circumstances. Turning briefly to LPP2, as I've mentioned before, there was something like 1,250 responses to the Regulation 19 consultation, and these are all now publicly available on the Council's website. We have some problems with LPP2, but we are still committed to actually submit the plan to the Planning Inspectorate by the end of this year. I've mentioned that there's a specific problem related to Hazelmere and allocating housing in Hazelmere, and the Western Planning Committee on 20th of July refused an application for the Red Coat site, which was part of the original housing allocation in the draft versions or the early version of LPP2. So we have a meeting this Thursday to consider this and consider what we should be doing about it. But as I say, we're still committed to get LPP2 out as fast to inspection as fast as we can, and by the end of this year. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod. Councillor Marriott.
Although the portfolio of equality, diversity and inclusion is a new one, and which I represent just at the moment, Waverley Borough Council have been including effects and considering effects of their actions and policies within their council for many years. Staff and officers have been taking steps to ensure all staff feel able to speak out if they feel they've been discriminated against, and also speak up for others who they think are facing discrimination. It has been common practice to consider the ways that Waverley's policies of actions may affect particular groups of people. Over the last years, Waverley have just seen the need to reappraise their approach to these equality issues and have acknowledged the strength of emotions that language, history and context can raise, where simple gestures such as taking the knee or allowing a statue to remain on Oxford College can produce and invoke very strong reactions. The large-scale sporting events which are now able to take place have highlighted the effect that discrimination is commonplace in certain sections of the community, when any person who fails and lets the team down in whatever team is considered is subjected to abuse on whatever grounds the abuser thinks applies. This can cause great distress to those on the receiving end of such abuse. On the other side of the coin, those who are considered as being in positions of power can inadvertently say things which can be misconstrued as attacking a particular group where no such meaning was meant. As community leaders, we recognise the need to understand the views being expressed, regardless of where we stand in our personal perspective, so that we can understand and truly represent all the members of the communities which we serve, especially those from underrepresented and protected groups. We need to be able to express ourselves in a way that is sensitive to others, while still being true to ourselves. As a first step, briefing sessions have been arranged for all councillors to attend, where members can discuss the issues raised and perhaps become aware of new issues themselves. The first of these sessions has already taken place and others are planned. Meanwhile, Waverley will continually work to adapt and improve their approach in this vital area of council business. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, everybody. Very quickly, just to announce that last Friday on the 30th, we published our unaudited draft accounts for fiscal 2020-21. This will go to the Audit Committee for approval in September alongside the external auditor's report and the Council's annual government statement. At 100 pages, more or less, it's a fairly daunting read, but I do commend it to everybody. It's available online and please look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. I will absolutely do that. Councillor Mirrlees.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's not a lot to report at the moment. We're still meeting up with the recipients of the SLAs, and I'm seeing the rest of the organisations, including Hopper and CAB, next week. Meanwhile, Waverley are providing activities for young people across the borough during the holidays, but that's about it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Mirrlees. Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, another brief one. I'm preparing the implementation of the parking proposals, which you've been consulted on, and I'd like to remind councillors that the SIL scheme resumes in September, and they are most welcome to contact me if they have any local groups who would be interested in applying but are unsure about any aspects of the process.
Thank you, Councillor Palmer. Councillor Rosman.
Thank you, Leader. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and everyone present and those watching on however method they wish to do so. In housing operations, we've reached a really great point in that London Court is now Legionnaires free. So that's really good news all round. A lot of work's gone into that. We now have some fire safety challenges at Riverside Court in Farnham, but work is being undertaken and a lot of resources have been spent trying to get the problems resolved as quickly as possible. As to antisocial behaviour, officers have successfully bid for additional funding for the Contain Outbreak Management Fund, and we will have 2 ASB officers until the 31st of March 2022. And on neighbour disputes, which we have seen a fair few recently, there is now a new SLA between housing and the mediation service in place, so hopefully some coaching will be possible. Rent collection is still holding up, and the procurement project for the longer term responsive repairs and voids contractor is on target, with assessments completed by the end of June, and it's now into the negotiation phase. Housing delivery still continues apace. Site B, Thacombe have continued with the groundworks on the site ahead of the first timber frame delivery. Site C, the demolition contractor expects to complete the demolition and the site clearance work in the next few weeks, and the tender for a build contractor to deliver the 30 new homes are underway. Chiddingfold, we've procured a build contractor for 5 sites, and the tender closes at the end of August. Badgers Close, Farncombe, the factory-built passive house standard modular homes have been successfully delivered, and we're now waiting for a date from Thames Water to connect the water supply. When connected and the site works have been completed, they will be commissioned before handover. And at Crossbay Close in Churt, the planning application for 12 new homes is expected to be validated shortly. In terms of homelessness, numbers are still really low. We've only got 1 household in temporary accommodation at the end of the quarter, and we have an officer seconded from the housing management team funded through the government's Rough Sleeper initiative. An application has also been made for capital and revenue grant funding from the ministry available through the Rough Sleeper accommodation to deliver 2 further homes. Community safety, as I said, there have been a few neighbour disputes. We've had 3 community triggers this year. The actions for them are all being monitored now through the community harm and risk management meeting, with each service taking responsibility for its actions. And as of last week, we appointed a ASB officer for 6 months, funded from the COVID grant, who is working on our long-term and more complex cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rosamond. And finally, Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Leader, Mr. Mayor and colleagues. First of all, the waste collection. Councillors continue to be updated on a regular basis by our officers on the situation regarding collections, particularly as there continue to be issues arising from the pandemic. And I know that councillors are grateful for those updates that they receive. In terms of waste collection, we're on schedule for the curbside collection of textiles and waste electrical and electronic equipment from September. Electric vehicle charging, we are looking for sites for further EV charging points in Waverley car parks, and we're working with Surrey County Council in terms of prioritising locations of on-street chargers. And on the subject of car parks, we are also investigating the provision of solar canopies in Waverley car parks, which would have the benefit of providing shading and shelter for vehicles alongside the obvious benefits of generating sustainable energy, and that work is ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Mr. Mayor, that concludes the updates from the Executive. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. We now move on to item 5. There have been 2 questions received, one from Councillor David Beeman and one from Councillor Steve Cossar. If I could call on Councillor Beeman, please, to read out your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. The question is quite simple. I've asked this to both Farntown Council and also the Surrey County Council Cabinet. So you're just getting the same question, which is basically Wednesday, the 22nd of September is designated World Car Free Day, in which motorists should be encouraged to give up their cars for a day. Given that Waverley Borough Council has declared a climate emergency, what initiatives do Waverley Borough Council intend to take to encourage councillors, staff and residents to use alternative forms of transport, that's public transport, cycling and walking, where they're available on that day. As I said, since both Surrey County Council and Fountain Council have also declared a climate emergency, I have asked a similar question at meetings of Surrey County Council's Cabinet, which was held on the 20th of July, and at Fountain Council Council, that was held on the 29th of July. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Freeman. Councillor Williams, I understand you're responding to this.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I thank Councillor Beeman for the question and the timely reminder of Wednesday, the 22nd of September as World Car Free Day. In response to the question, I would confirm that Waverley Borough Council will be promoting World Car Free Day by promoting the day on social media through press releases, encouraging residents to leave the car at home and use alternative forms of transport as part of our drive to promote active and sustainable transport, consistent with our support for Take the Jump. Notwithstanding the misconceptions that about Take the Jump that were articulated by Councillor Hyman earlier this evening. Secondly, we're promoting World Car Free Day by encouraging our own staff and councillors to avoid using cars on that day, coming to work by alternative transport if staff need to come into work at all, or work from home on the 22nd of September. We are promoting the day in advance of the 22nd of September, alerting residents to the event by means of posters in all Waverley car parks, encouraging residents to leave the car at home and use alternative forms of transport on that day. And we will be publicising activities that can lead to longer term changes to travel choices, such as bikeability training, a public transport journey planning tool, and a walk your child to school message. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Costa, would you please read out your question?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Residents in the Godalming area continue to be concerned about the lack of any communication from the council about its intentions and proposals in respect of the land occupied by Broadwater Park Golf Club. Can I please be given an assurance that this matter will be brought back to an early full council meeting for an update and consideration of future options? And can I also be advised as to when the council expect to be able to inform residents on this matter?
Thank you, Councillor Costa. I believe Councillor Merriweather, you're going to answer this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Costa. Yes, the negotiation between the council and Broadwater Park Golf Club Limited regarding the future lease arrangements of Broadwater Park is still ongoing. Until this process is concluded, this matter remains commercially sensitive and both parties are bound by the terms of a confidentiality agreement. As soon as an agreement has been reached in principle, the terms will be put before councillors for consideration. Councillor Costa, ward members and the chairman of Value for Money ONS committee received an update from officers last week. All I can say in public is that we continue to work with the company to secure the best outcome for the site in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. Those are the questions from members. So we now move on to item 6, which is motions, and I can report that no motions have been received. Thank you. So over to item 7, which is the main agenda for tonight. Now, it's the local government collaboration update, and I understand Chief Executive is now going to leave the room. Thank you. Members, please ensure that during the course of debate, you do not refer to any material contained in the exempt pink papers. If members wish to refer to any of this information, the meeting must resolve to exclude the press, and the public. Thank you. Now, can I call on Councillor Paul Follows to introduce and move the recommendations and amendment? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will try and be as brief as possible this evening to allow members to ask questions and discuss. I hope, however, to cover a couple of points that have been raised in advance that could well be common questions for the evening. We have support this evening from our officers, but also David Maycott from South East Employers. And David, thank you for attending this evening. Appreciated. Members will recall the resolutions of the previous session. The outputs of these now comprise recommendations 1 through 6 of this session. Now, I appreciate the pace of this process is somewhat brisk, but the administration is keen to meet the scale of the funding challenge and see no reason to delay. Just for clarity, these recommendations relate almost exclusively to the appointment of a joint chief executive. Now, recommendation 1 asks members to note the progress on wider heads of terms. It is the intention to task the new joint chief executive to continue this process. Now, to do otherwise, we feel would be rushed and missing out on an opportunity for that new person to undertake this core work and lead that work. But we do believe we have sufficient detail in these papers to address the subject of hand, the appointment of that new chief executive. Recommendation 2 confirms a job description, a small amendment to which I will get to in a moment. It also confirms title, employing authority, salary, and the remainder of the process to be undertaken. Recommendation 3 creates a joint employment committee. As previously stated, Guildford Borough Council has a constitutional requirement to hold such a committee with specific representation and members. Now, much of this is in practice replicated at Waverley Borough Council anyway, but the Guildford Borough Council committee has been used as a base for the terms of reference for this joint committee proposed here. And recommendation 4 appoints members to that committee, which has been proposed to be the leader of the council, myself, the deputy leader of the council, Councillor Peter Clark, and the leader of the principal opposition, Councillor Stephen Mulliner. And this has been replicated with the exact same process at Guildford Borough Council. Recommendation 5 explains how settlement costs for the joint chief executive role will be apportioned and makes it clear where pension strain sits, which is with the original authority where that member of staff currently works. Recommendation 6 allocates funding for any costs that we are liable for to be met by the general fund. If I may conclude by introducing a small amendment which has been circulated in advance to the job description, which is Annex 2 in your papers, and the amendment that you should have in front of you on the table, with the additional requirement regarding IT and digital literacy and competency. This has been set out in advance, but I will just apologise for the late arrival of this. I mean, we did send it around last night. It had been discussed over the course of the last week, but there was an uncertainty as to whether there was a need to introduce this as an amendment or not. But in discussion with officers, the recommendation is that really a belt and braces approach to anything regarding HR matters and proven and authorisation is probably wise. And as a result, I'm presenting that amendment to that job description before you. I would ask council if they might consider adopting this amendment by assent. But obviously that will be a matter for the mayor. I have a seconder, of course, both for the substantive subject and the amendment.
Thank you. Pleased to support this, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. So I'm now going to throw it open for questions. Is there any councillor who wishes to ask? Councillor Mulliner.
Can we clarify, are we talking about the amendment at the moment?
We would talk to the amendment first, just while the amendment's here, yes.
Was the amendment being put?
Mr. Mayor, I would like to move the amendment. I thought I had done so as part of my original speech, but I'm happy to move the amendment. And I do believe for the clarity of the debate, it would make sense to do that first and to make that part of the substantive. I'm not sure if there is any opposition to that amendment, but obviously that would be for members to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Councillor Hyman.
Speaking to the amendment, Mr. Mayor, I understand that this has come about because of a member at Guildford Borough Council at their council meeting last week, Wednesday, Thursday last week, had put in an amendment that added that the job description for the joint chief executive role would have to have such experience in respect of electronic working and digital working. If we were not to, so it's come in front of us because if we agree something different to what they've agreed, it would just be difficult. Now, I can understand a lot of people would think, well, it goes without saying that someone who's got a degree and all the rest of it that's required in this is obviously going to have such experience. But I would very much hope that members here tonight would accept that this is something which really is an administrative blip, and the sort of thing that we are going to get when we're working with other councils, where because they've done it, we should do it as well. And I don't think this should be seen as a showstopper, so I will support it, even though I'm not entirely supportive of everything that's in the papers, and we'll discuss that later. I would ask that members simply support the amendment so that we can get on with the rest of the business. Thank you.
And Councillor Hyman, are there any other councillors that wish to speak on the amendment? If not, then we'll carry on to vote on the amendment. Councillor Follows, did you want to speak the amendment?
No, I'm happy to go to a vote, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah. So we'll go to a vote. Do we need a roll call? No, it seems fairly unanimous, doesn't it? So can I just have an assent, please?
Agreed.
Thank you all. So we'll move on to the actual motion itself, please. Councillor Follows, did you want to say anything on that?
I'm no happy to go to members and discuss as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Councillors, Councillor Molnar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. The issue that the Conservative Group has with where we are at the moment is really summarised by the pace at which things are happening. And the fact that if you look at the substantive motions, 2D, which refers to whether the Joint Chief Executive should be appointed from an internal pool or an external pool, is being presented as a fait accompli. It's not something which you can detach from the whole project. And as members will know, we are fundamentally sceptical about the wisdom of this particular example of local government collaboration, for the obvious reason that the cost savings which are now visible are very small. As local partnerships pointed out, they're an amount which is less than 2% of the combined expenditure of the two councils. And this is made even more stark when you consider the worst state of Guildford's finances compared to our own, which has been underlined recently by events such as the recent fire sale of the Liongate office in Ladymead to reduce their debt. And also at their council meeting last week, an unopposed statement that it was going to take them 6 years to return to balance. So whether we should be taking any steps before we have got certain things clear, to us is very doubtful. And although I will be very careful not to refer to sensitive matters, I would invite everyone to turn to page 24 of their pack, and that is the original pack. And that is one of the exempt items. But I draw your attention to the bottom third of the page, entitled My Recommendations. And I just suggest that you read the middle subparagraph, beginning "if the post," and just absorb the message of that and what it implies for Waverley's relative position in this proposed collaboration. I know it's supposed to be strict equality, but somehow the references to size and lead council on cost sharing make me wonder what the reality is going to be. And that is why, Mr. Mayor, the absence of any serious drafting of the inter-authority agreement is so troubling. I feel obliged to point out this is not a new issue. The first signs of perhaps moving to collaboration were made known in February of this year when the two council executives met. One would have thought that someone would have pointed out that the inter-authority agreement, or IAA, was going to be an absolutely essential element. And to have that in finished form before anyone was asked to take any serious or irrevocable decisions would be very important. I can appreciate it's a complex document, but it would have been done by other local authorities, and it should not have been impossible for the legal advisors who are referred to as advising us now to find an example, perhaps from East Hants and Havant or Worthing and Ada, who are mentioned as examples, which could be redacted to preserve confidentiality, but to give us a much better sense of how the crucial cost sharing and savings sharings will operate in practice. And it is not reassuring to be told that's going to be one of the first jobs of the Joint Chief Executive. To us, it seems we're putting the cart very firmly in front of the horse. So I would actually like an assurance from the leader that we are not going to be asked to take any irrevocable steps or near irrevocable ones, such as the formal appointment of a Joint Chief Executive, until the IAA has been put before us in time for suitable scrutiny and consideration. After all, we wouldn't be taking this first step if it was not to achieve, not among other things, but as a crucial part, significant savings. And even if they can't be seen, we should be able to understand how two councils with such different financial positions, different methods of working, Guildford using direct service and Waverley preferring,
can you wrap
I'm very close, and Waverley using contractors, how you can easily understand how they can share costs and savings fairly. My final point is the word savings does not appear in the draft IAA at all, and that does not help. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Molnar. If I could then have Councillor Else, that's Jenny Else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I make no apologies for saying something very, very similar to that which we've just heard, but perhaps in different words, because I feel this is so important. And before we vote on this issue, we should reflect on how we've arrived at this particular point. Why are we doing it? Well, it's for cost savings reason, and the council has already voted for it on that basis. If we do it, well, we've been presented with an unquantified risk assessment with no red lines. How we do it, we've now been presented with an incomplete heads of terms. Who is going to facilitate it? A Joint Chief Executive will be appointed. This is the order in which a huge change such as this should be considered, but it seems to be in a slightly different order. And as my colleague has just said, the cart is firmly before the horse. So being very careful as I can not to stray into pink papers, the heads of terms, before any decisions are made about any of these issues, a heads of terms agreement must be established. But we do have a complete lack of detail in that respect, as is shown in these papers. Regarding the new role, the advice appears to be an advantage in internal advertising. Stop me if you feel I'm straying. I don't mean to, but I feel this is such an important point. There's not really very many reasons given for keeping the advertising for this post internal. I really feel that it's such a key post requiring such specialist skills. And surely we have the HR skills within two council bodies to ensure proper and appropriate management so that we are not held to ransom with any potential threat which may have been established. If the job is advertised externally and an internal applicant is successful, then we will have the confidence to know that we do have the very best candidate possible. In 6.4.1 on page 10, we're told there are no equality or diversity inclusion implications. I beg to differ. By the ring fencing of this application, were we to do it, and that kept to internal advertising, there are huge equality and diversity implications which must not be ignored. And finally, we don't have a fully considered risk assessment which has been quantified. Should have been given to us by now, because we're all equally responsible for making this ultimate decision. And yet we're asked to make a decision without proper information.
30 seconds remaining.
What we have is a risk list, not an assessment. There are no red lines, no brakes, a dangerous runaway train approach. No such risk assessment has been completed that we've seen. Are you content, colleagues, that you have enough information to make this monumental decision, or do you need to abstain from agreeing for the moment? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Else. I have two more hands, Councillor Goodrich and Gray. I will go to the leader first. Do you wish to answer any of this now, or would you rather wait?
I'm happy to sum up after a few more members have spoken, if that's all right, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The facts of this case are in a way disturbing. Guildford, it is a fact, is in a worse financial deficit situation than we are. None of the papers today show what savings will be made. Previous papers made it clear the savings to services would be minimal. And one can conclude that most of the savings are therefore going to be related to staff, which I think is unfortunate. And as we have not got this heads of agreement finalized, and I had certainly assumed that it would have been, and that today, or when the council meeting was, next council meeting was produced, that this document would be finalized. I appreciate it's a delicate situation to try and agree between two authorities how you're going to share savings, but you know, that's the fact of the matter, is that we must know how these savings are to be shared, if there are savings. And I'm very unhappy to vote for something when I don't have the detail of the heads of agreement. Just the paragraph headings is all we've got. And Councillor Mulliner has referred to page 24 about reference to Guildford and its role that it might play. I think that is very disturbing and does show in a way that this council is going to be the poor relation. I don't want to be a poor relation in a collaborative or an agreement between two councils. Reference is made to whether it should be an internal or an external appointment. And the exempt papers 28 and 29 deal with that. And under the middle of page 29, there's a paragraph that says for member agreement. And the middle sentence of that doesn't make sense. I can refer to the 5 words in, if you like, because that if you took the first 6 words of that sentence, I don't know what appointed to means. I'm not referring to the, anything that, but perhaps we should go into exempt to have this explained as to what advice we're getting. But as I understand it, the ring fencing is referring to the internal appointment. And I too would be much happier if we took this matter externally, with, of course, current employees being able to apply with the external candidates. So the final question I have is on page, which is white papers, on page 36, which is the back page, paragraph 3, it's made clear that the Joint Appointments Committee cannot have a chairman's casting vote. And therefore, if that appointments panel should, for example, vote 3 in one way and 3 another way, they can't make a decision. Does that mean that then the matter comes back to both councils to decide the matter? I would just like clarification as to what happens if it should be a 3-3 vote or a 2-2 vote if somebody's absent, where you can't have a chairman's casting vote. That could produce a problem as I see it. So I would welcome an answer to that in due course. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I just thought I would try and update us some of the questions where we are so far, just thinking because I can do the first bit without going into exempt.
Yes,
Might
and
just
I
be
will leave
helpful.
you to answer at the end.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of cost saving for the Joint Chief Executive, it's sharing, it's 50-50, and it does say so. Even this initial step in terms of saving is not really something to sniff at, and of course it is just the first step. And 2D, and I will ask Mr. Maycock to comment if I've got this incorrectly. Process outlined in 2D, when we make somebody at risk in this way, it's my understanding that we have to offer the appointment to the internal candidates in this way. And I was just wondering, Mr. Mayor, if I could ask Mr. Maycock to comment before I go on.
Indeed. Can you answer that?
Yes, thank you. It's a question of options, really. I mean, when you're in this position, there are two areas to be considered. One, and I think this is in Jennifer's paper, but one is the Local Government Housing Act, which says you have to appoint on merit. But the other issue is in the Employment Relations Act, which says that where posts are at risk of redundancy, then you would be looking at ring-fencing. So it's a question of balancing those two and making a decision. Hope that helps.
Thank you. If I may carry on, so in terms of the inter-authority agreement, I mean, you can look at this lots of different ways. From my perspective, to do this properly, you do need some level of joint leadership to get it done and maximise the opportunities and financial and otherwise that you can derive from such an agreement. So really getting it to the point that we can hire a joint chief executive to lead the process going forward for doing the IAA properly, to me seems sensible. There are certainly different ways you could interpret that, and there's no ideal way of doing this, I don't believe. And when you look at the sorts of authority agreements that have been done elsewhere, it ends up being so customized to the particular authorities in question that it's only of some utility to the process. In terms of the appointment committees in a 3-3 vote, obviously that committee has no power to do anything on its own. It merely recommends. And my understanding of the process would be that if there was a 3-3 vote, it would just be unable to give a recommendation. And so there would be no recommendations made if there was a 3-3 vote. In terms of some of the points that Councillor Mullen made, and Councillor Else actually too, no decisions realistically are revocable. I mean, realistically, we've all sat here and watched Brexit, which many of us thought would be desperately irrevocable, and it obviously is if you really, really want to. Few councillors have mentioned things about relative sizes of the council and how we're going to be the puny minion in the process, but social housing, Guildford 5,206, Waverley 4,783, general fund expenditure, Guildford 17 million, Waverley 15 million, HRA expenditure, Guildford 24 million, Waverley 29 million. I mean, there are lots of different metrics you could use. Sometimes we're bigger, sometimes they're bigger. It's not a huge variance in any case, and it's pretty swings and roundabouts. I'm fairly sure that this collaboration would be one of the largest that have happened in the country, might even be the largest that there is in the country if it goes ahead. And actually the differences are not saying they're skin deep, but they're not massive. There are reasons why this might make sense, both for geography and economic reasons. Going back to the other point, though, that was really the base of the size comment, the employer chosen in the event of an outside appointment. I know what that recommendation says from South East employers. This has been discussed between the leaders, deputy leaders of Guildford and Waverley. In the event of an outside appointment, the only thing that comes into play here is cost. And the most cost-effective choice for the appointment would be the appointment to Waverley Borough Council, where it is the most cost-effective place to do so. And this is not disputed by Guildford. And I'm happy to give the assurances that the most cost-effective authority will always be chosen when that is something that we have to factor in. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Follis. Can I just ask, Councillor Goodrich raised a question about a sentence with an exempt. I don't particularly want to discuss that, obviously, without going into exempt. Did you understand the question? Is there something you can say to that that would not go into exempt?
Could I actually ask Councillor Goodrich to repeat the question, because I've definitely not written it down right, and I apologise, Councillor Goodrich.
Councillor Goodrich, if you could repeat, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's on the pink papers, page 29.
Yeah.
4-member agreement. So this is the Southeast Employers Report. And the middle sentence, the first 6 words, I don't understand how that links in with the context of the rest of the sentence.
My understanding is that that is the alternative position should the appointment not be taken up by somebody who is internally available to see it. So, for example, should neither of the current incumbents at Guildford or Waverley want to take the opportunity of the appointment up, it would then go out to the wider advertising. So, in other words, if the reason for the ring fence it lapses effectively, it would be advertised publicly. That's my understanding of the wording.
Thank you. I think if we discuss this any further, we'll have to go into exam. So I would hope that satisfies you, Councillor Goodrich.
It doesn't really, because the 3rd sentence deals with that scenario.
Okay, then we'll leave that.
No, apologies, Mr. Mayor. That's if there's somebody who is appointed. That is somebody. If somebody does apply, they go through the process and they are not successful. The 3rd statement applies. The 2nd statement applies if nobody applies. They are different, I believe. If Mr. Maycott may be able to clarify further if I'm incorrect.
Yes, you'll have to stop me if I go into an area that I'm not allowed to. As I understand it, and obviously I've spoken to Jennifer about this paper, knowing that I was coming tonight. The first point is clear. This is in respect of an internal appointment, and the third paragraph, the third part of that section is when you go externally. That, as I understand it, or my interpretation of this middle point, is it's twofold. One, if you advertise internally and do not appoint internally, that's one scenario of this. And the second is, again, if you don't appoint internally, that it may be that because of it's the knock-on effect, there may be other people within the organisations who are at risk of redundancy, and at this post, the Joint Chief Executive, I think it's unlikely, but it's possible that other people at the upper echelons of either authority who are at risk of redundancy may feel that this post is suitable alternative employment for them. And there is, of course, a duty when you're making redundancies to consider suitable alternative employment. And if that's the case, then the recommendation here is that the post would be ring-fenced to those people.
Thank you. Now I have 2 other speakers, Councillors Gray and Councillor Dixon. Yes, Councillor Munro, I've seen your hand, but of course you've already spoken. Could I speak?
I just wish to ask a question to hopefully clarify this, because I think what we've been told does actually help. But I hadn't appreciated there could be a 2-stage internal process. First,
if it's to clarify,
and then to other senior people.
Thank you for that. Councillor Gray, and then Councillor Dixon, and then Councillor Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could get members to look at the top of page 7, I have a point of clarification which is concerning me a little bit. We have in there a figure, a salary that's proposed for this, and it talks about duties and statutory, all allowances, all duties, all statutory responsibilities, with the exception of election duties. As members know, the election duties carries with it a responsibility payment. As the intention is, and again, not wanting to stray into pink paper, as is the intention that that the electoral duties is to be written in the job description, then wouldn't it have been better to show the true figure at the top of page 7, the figure that includes that allowance? One clarification question, as there are 2 councils with 1 Joint Chief Executive, which is going to take on 2 responsibilities. Does that mean he gets 2 lots of electoral payments, 1 from Guildford and 1 from Waverley? The reason I ask that question, because it may seem stupid to some people around here, but we are acting
as though Guildford and Waverley are two separate organisations, other than the fact sharing a joint chief executives. So I think it's important to clarify that. So what is the allowance? What's that figure, including the allowance? What is that figure if they get two lots of allowances? That's my question, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Make it easier for the leader.
Thank you to Councillor Gray. Now, normally we would wait for the summing up, but again, for clarification, if I could ask Councillor Follows.
Yeah, I'll ask him, if possible, Mr. Mayor, for Graham Clark's comment in a moment, but a couple of points I would just add. There is actually no there is no actual default reason that the chief executive or managing director actually does the election side of it. My understanding is actually the MD of Guildford does not, whereas the chief executive of Waverley does. So it's not necessarily the case that they will always do that. But I would ask, Mr. Mayor, if you're all happy for Graham just to comment on how that would work financially.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask for a point? Could I ask for a point of clarification? I did say, and I was trying to be careful, I did say that it's actually embedded in the job description. So the decision has been made.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Right, if we could ask the officer to answer, please.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, as the leader said, the role of returning officer doesn't, or deputy returning officer doesn't necessarily follow with the head of paid service. In this case, a joint chief executive, accepting that it is within the proposed job description here. In terms of the appointment, it's actually a separate employment. The returning officer it's not part of the chief executive role. So currently, Tom Horwood has one employment as chief executive for Waverley and one employment as returning officer for Waverley. So whilst it might be rolled up in the job description, so it is currently the intention that would be the case, that is not within this salary range. I understand the question Councillor Gray raised. It also, there isn't a fixed amount for the election. Part of the election duty is driven by an amount, depending on which election it is, whether it's a local election or a parliamentary, and that amount then would go to the returning officer. So in other words, there is no fixed figure that I could say now, or even an indicative one, because it very much depends on the elections and the allowances that are provided for within there.
Mr. Mayor, could I just ask that my
Councillor Gray.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor.
I have other speakers. Can you just...
I understand, but I think it's fair to residents that, I mean, if we've got a salary in here, they can read these papers. And I think all I would ask the Section 151 officer is if he could tell people how much somebody with that responsibility would get during a national parliamentary election. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. I think you made your point. Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just wanted to start by congratulating the executive in the speedy and the office in the speedy creation of these documents. I think we're making extremely good progress, what I hope will be very financially beneficial to the council. And we do have a lot of money savings that we need to find. I did want to bring up something about the internal versus the external recruitment issue. And I noticed on the bottom of page 28 that we're looking at two specific pieces of legislation. But my concern is how this looks from the outside, particularly when we are doing training ourselves and we're looking to embrace equality, diversity and inclusivity. I wondered, are we looking at the right legislation? Is there any legislation that would force us to act differently? And even if there is no legislation, in the terms of equality, would it not be best to advertise this job externally? That's just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Councillor Coster, I believe you were next, then Councillor Martin, and then Councillor
Thank you very
Clark.
much, Mr. Mayor. 2 points. Interestingly, the first one echoes quite closely what's just been said by last speaker, Councillor Dixon. I think it's listening to the debate, it's the one issue that I don't think we've had a proper answer to, and one that I think we need to consider much more carefully. The point made by Councillor Else, and indeed other speakers, was that if we are serious as an organisation, as a council, about inclusion, about equality, and having just appointed a cabinet member to cover those areas, I assume we are, then we have to think really seriously, carefully, not only for those reasons, but because we have a duty and a responsibility to ensure that we provide the best level of service to those we're here to represent. We have to think really carefully about why we are restricting the field for the top post in those two organisations to the two sitting candidates. Now, I listened as carefully as I could to what Mr. Maycock said when he was asked to explain this by the leader. My understanding of what he said is, well, there's a conflict here. There's certainly a piece of legislation that talks about having to appoint on merit. And there is, I wasn't sure, I'm sorry, whether it was regulations, legislation, guidance, whatever, that talks about ring fencing. So I don't even know if there's a hierarchy here. But what it did suggest to me is that there is a decision that has to be taken by those who are responsible for this. And what I'm seeing at the moment, and I certainly want some further clarification from the leader on this, what I'm seeing at the moment is a decision has been taken which is not in favour of equality and is not in favour of getting the best candidate. That's my first point. My second one, very briefly, is this. I was a little bit concerned to hear from Councillor Hyman that apparently the reason we got the amendment this evening was because somebody in Guildford had the idea, and well, it's not terribly controversial, is it? So we better bring it back here because we've got to do everything together, and we had no problem with it. What really does start to worry me, however, is if we're going to continue on this journey, there are going to be some much tougher decisions to take than this. And if every time we disagree with each other, we're going to have to bounce things around between the councils, I think we're going to be involved almost as a ping pong council. And I've seen this happen before in areas where simply services have been shared. There is not agreement between members of the council, and there are constant delays and difficulties because there has not been agreement. And I would like some further comment from the leader about how far he thinks this is actually going to characterise the way that any joint arrangement might work in the future. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. Councillor Martin, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too am concerned regarding recommendation 2D. I've got many doubts about the collaboration exercise, and indeed doubts about the process that we're following. And I think this is this can be really encapsulated in 2D. We are wanting the best possible joint chief executive and in conformity with EDI considerations. And I have to say, I'm really not satisfied that the proposed process here will deliver us the best joint chief executive, especially if, for instance, only one of the two incumbents wish to apply. And of course, I understand that the Joint Appointments Committee would then look and would have to consider that candidate and whether that particular candidate meets the bar. But that is made very difficult if there are no external candidates also applying. So that I think that it would be much better and a much more sensible approach to advertise externally. The incumbents may then apply if they wish, and we could then ensure that the Joint Appointments Committee are really able to look at a number of candidates. And if the internal candidate or candidates are of the caliber that we need and meet the requirements, then that would be fine. We would have tested it externally. But this process means that we don't do that. And I'm very concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. I have Councillor Clark next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've heard several speakers talk about cart and the horse. So I'd just like to take an opportunity to confirm the exact positioning in relation to the cart and the horse. With the formation of the Joint Appointments Committee mentioned in this evening's motion, we can make the move to finalise, if necessary, the job description. And with the guidance of South East employers, we can interview the candidates from the ring fence pool of existing Guildford and Waverley candidates. If the committee is minded to make an appointment from the pool, then it is our hope that the new shared chief executive will be in place as soon as this October. This person can then focus on the content of the inter-authority agreement, which of course will come back to both councils for their approval. Once this has been done and the IAA is signed by both councils, then the work really gets underway, with the chief executive recommending the structure of a new senior management team. And once this team is in place, the steps that will follow will be developing business cases for shared services, which is where the major savings are going to be found. So I urge members to support the motion, as I've not heard anything this evening to convince me otherwise. Thank you.
Councillor Clark, I now have Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am very concerned, actually. I skipped past it and hadn't noticed, and I do thank Councillor Mulliner very much for drawing our attention to what it says in the penultimate paragraph on page 24 of the document there. Now, as I read that, Mr. Mayor, and at the same time I read the document which tells me the recommendations, which says that the future joint chief executive would be employed by the council, which we would currently work for. If we take the two of those together, that looks to me as if we are to take the advice of South East employers, as I think we're being told to do, then the decision as to who the new chief executive officer would be has already been made, and I can't really support that. How on earth could we, any of Waverley's members, support something that basically tells us that that the new joint chief executive officer is going to be employed by their host council, and that it isn't going to be Waverley? I just don't see how any of us could be expected to support that, and those who have said as an alternative we should be appointing, we should certainly be putting it out externally. I would absolutely agree with that 100%. But I have a greater difficulty here, because I recall when we looked at documents back in, oh crikey, it was documents from the 11th of June, a collaboration between Guildford and Waverley document, local partnerships feasibility study, and that told us that the savings that that were made through the joint working would be expected to be apportioned in accordance with the MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Community Local Government, spending power assessments, which is the way that the Treasury apportion grants to different councils. So if then we've got one document telling me that we're going to be apportioning the savings over time in accordance with government measures, and yet I'm being told today, and nobody said anything to the contrary, that that it's going to be a straight 50-50 split. Well, which is it? You know, I do have some problems here where there are so many unanswered questions and apparent contradictions in what we're seeing here. I mean, certainly we ought to know what we're going to be paying people. I don't accept the argument that we don't know how much we're going to pay. We pay people for election expenditure, for the election returning officer role. We could obviously have an average of 5 years of what's been received. You know, we are grown up enough to be told how much money somebody gets, and if we add that on to what is being offered as the new higher rate for a chief executive officer, you know, are we going to be paying these people twice as much as the Prime Minister? Or I mean, you know, we do need to be able to look at this before we make any decisions, because we really do open ourselves up for a lot of criticism in the direction that we're heading, I think. We've heard nothing at all about planning, how the two councils are going to be approaching planning or commercial property investments. You know, how will we tie it up if both councils are bidding for the same supermarket in Bromley or wherever it happens to be? You know, there is so much that needs to be done, and I don't really want to join the cart before the horse brigade, but I do think that we must have this IAA before we move forward. We are doing things the wrong way round. And we're certainly in a position, as far as I'm concerned, with what Councillor Mulliner pointed out on page 24, that is telling me that I can't vote for this. Because there's a contradiction here in what we're doing. We're being told that the best person's going to win and all the rest of it, but actually, if you put these two together, the recommendation and that penultimate paragraph there, then it tells me the decision's already made, or we're going to ignore the advice of South East employers. I want some answers. Actually, what I want is is this to go before certainly some sort of joint ONS, so that we can ensure it's done properly. I mean, we can't have any dispute resolution without a duty of candour, can we, and that sort of thing. So can we please do this properly?
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Councillor Follows, you want to?
Could I just sum up on a couple, not sum up, but just to go answer some of the last 3 or 4 speakers, just to get us back on, back to even again. Firstly, thank you to Councillor Dixon for reminding us why we're doing this in the first place. A lot of the questions that you asked in regards to equality and diversity are also questions I asked right at the beginning of South East Employers and others, our own HR and Guildford's HR. I will again defer to Mr. Maycock in a moment in regards to how that legislation actually works. But my understanding is it is a hierarchy that requires us to act in this fashion. In terms of Councillor Hyman's points, we obviously don't and can't predetermine an outcome, but we can, of course, foresee possible outcomes. They are either going to be a Guildford employee, a Waverley employee, or an outside employee. Now, if it's one of the existing candidates, they stay with their current employer. And if it's an external candidate, I am giving you, for the second time tonight, the assurance that it will be the most cost-effective employer, which I know to be Waverley. So that is what will happen in that situation. Those are the outcomes that are foreseeably possible without putting any names to any of those outcomes. The ping pong issue that Councillor Cossa pointed out, I actually agree with you completely. And I'll be quite candid. It's frustrated me an awful lot the way that that's actually happened. But actually what it has done for me is crystallise the need for a single joint chief executive authority to actually direct both councils. The reason for the ping-ponging is because no single officer can currently direct both councils to do something. It leads to delays, it leads to issues, it leads to misunderstandings, and we do our best to work in the gap. But actually, one of the main reasons we're doing this is actually to make this a clear and led process that we can actually work through going forward. It is also why the inter-authority agreement needs to also be led by that joint chief executive, because it needs to be somebody who can direct both authorities to do a thing, whatever that thing is. Putting cart before the horse again, I have to say, Councillor Hyman, I'm not going to get into how we're going to deal with planning and various other things that are so far down the road of a joint, but beyond the first step here, that it would be almost completely improper for me to start speculating. That is why we want to have this new joint role, so that we can actually have a coherent officer team to direct the rest going forward. Now, every stage of that is going to come back to council. When the inter-authority agreement is finalised, it'll come back to council. When anybody who applies for the job will have to go through the joint recruitment panel. If they get a recommendation, it'll come back to both councils. If they don't, then it's going to have to go outside. The process is quite clear on this. So I will, with your indulgence, Mr. Mayor, ask Mr. Maycock if he could just clarify the legislation side of this again, particularly in regards to equality and diversity, if that's possible, because I know that's something bothering a lot of members and certainly bothered me, particularly at the beginning. And it will certainly be part of the process when we interview candidates, because obviously this is something that is embedded in our corporate strategy, and it's also embedded in Guildford's corporate strategy. They are things that we care about, and they'll be asked to say what they're going to do. So if I may, Mr. Mayor, defer to Mr. Maycock.
Mr. Maycock, if you'd like to answer that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'll try to explain this again. It is a question. I think one of the members here did describe this as a choice, and actually that is what it is. There is no hierarchy of legislation here. We've got two pieces of legislation: the Local Government Housing Act and the Employment Rights Act, that are butting against each other. And the law does that sometimes. That's just the reality of where we are. Now, the Local Government Housing Act does say that you you should appoint on merit, i.e. get the best person for the job. And therefore that's why there's the argument in there for going towards an external appointment. However, that has to be weighed against, and this is where the equality implications, I believe, come in, that has to be weighed against the Employment Rights Act. Now, I say that one act isn't more important than the other, but the Employment Rights Act says that where there are where there is a potential redundancy situation, which of course there will be, because you have two heads of paid service, two chief executives, excuse the term, I know you use a different term here, but and you only need one person will be redundant. Under the legislation, the Employment Rights Act, redundancy provisions, you are under a legal duty to try to mitigate the number of redundancies. And seek alternative employment or whatever it might be. Now, of course, one way of doing this in the situation that is before you is to say we will attempt to recruit internally first, and it is a choice. Jennifer, who's written this paper, has made the recommendation that she feels that it's the right way to go to try to recruit internally first because of this redundancy issue, and as I say, this duty to mitigate against redundancies. I hope that helps clarify.
Sorry, I've got my microphone. Councillor Merriweather, you haven't spoken yet, so I'll take you next. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I heard you just fine. So I'm not going to talk about some of the interpretations that I've heard of what's in front of us, except just to point out that the penultimate paragraph on page 24 does start with the words, "if the post is not recruited to internally," which kind of makes a nonsense of the argument that it's a predetermination of some sort. What I would like to do is just simply remind everybody that we've heard some comments about the relative positions of the two councils this evening. Both councils have their own strengths, their own weaknesses, but Waverley is not immune to what's going on in the current funding climate, and will have to make savings. We may not have to make savings as great as Guildford. We may have to make more savings than Guildford in some respects. But just to say that Guildford might have to make more savings than we do isn't really an argument against collaboration. The second point is the references that I've heard to the local partnerships report, which seem to suggest it's being interpreted by some members as being exhaustive and prescriptive when it goes out of its way to say that it is not. It is not exhaustive, it's not prescriptive, it is illustrative, but it gives us a very clear steer that there are savings to be made, and we are responsible. If we are going to be responsible, we should look into them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. Now, before I invite Councillor Else and Molnar to speak again, is there any other councillor that hasn't spoken yet that wishes to ask a question? Councillor Beeman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Just a question to the representative from South East Employers. I mean, there have been other examples where councils have merged, either through force majeure or whatever. Is there any precedent in those councils that we're aware of that puts merit before the other factor?
Sorry, Councillor, I can't answer that question. I wasn't involved in that. The only two I know about within the region that I represent, the South East, are the two that Jennifer's mentioned in her paper, and I do not know what the arrangements were in those cases. Apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Maycock. Councillor Sadler.
Hi, yeah, just a short, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one question. If either of the incumbent chief officers at the moment should decline to want to apply or became ill or for some other reason, would it automatically put the remaining person in pole position?
Mr. Maycock, could you answer that?
Was that for me? Apologies. No, because if there is one internal candidate, then of course that person will still have to go through the full recruitment process. And it's by no means a certainty that that either of those candidates would actually meet the criteria and get through the process. So it's a no.
Thank you, Mr. Maycock. I'll just explain that because of the importance of this subject, obviously, we need to clarify as we go along, rather than leave it too long and forget what the question is. So I am allowing Mr. Maycock and others to answer. Councillor Else. That's Jenny Else.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just really, I wanted a couple of points of clarification, if I may. I don't understand. I don't think Councillor Gray's point, could it be explained again, please? Because the key responsibilities involve the returning officer and electoral registration officer duties on page 4, and also mentioned again statutory role of electoral register officer in the job description on page 9. Now, that was what I understood Councillor Gray to be saying, that it's in there. And then I understood Graham Clark to say that it wasn't necessarily part of the job. I'd just like clarification on that, please, because if it isn't, why is it in the job description? And the other thing, if I may, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Can we be quite sure, quite sure, that without a head of terms or an IAA, that the job description will be fit for purpose? Because we don't really know yet what the agreement is. So how, therefore, do we know what we require from a joint chief executive? Who is going to apply, should it go externally, for a job description that really hasn't been, it doesn't bear relation to what's required of the job? Because we don't know what's required of the job until we've got an IAA. And so it's a bit like those that don't like the cart before the horse. Can I throw another analogy in? A chicken and the egg, what comes first? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Else. Now, Graham Clark, I understand you wanted to say something?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Yes, so I've just looked up an amount for an electoral payment for the returning officer. So the 2019 parliamentary election attracted a fee for the returning officer of £2,815, if that helps put some scale to it. And that is probably typical, but it would vary according to which election. And Mr. Mayor, could I just refer to the bottom bullet point in the job description that refers to electoral registration officer and the returning officer, both of which are separate from each other, and they're both statutory appointments that are made by council. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the chief executive, or in this case, a joint chief executive, would get those positions. And each council, so Guildford and Waverley, would have to make an approval for that. And just at the bottom of that bullet point within the job description, it refers to, sorry, I'm on page 17, apologies, Mr. Mayor. For such period as the contract of employment is in place or the council determines otherwise, which refers to the council's ability to change that at any point. Mr. Mayor, I hope that's helpful in response to the question regarding those statutory appointments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Now, I have got Mr. Councillor Molnar.
I just want to ask a question.
What you have, but if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, I didn't want to speak again, but I am very keen that we all understand very precisely the implications of these two separate pieces of legislation, one of which makes what I think many of us think was the obvious point, that one should appoint on merit, particularly for a very important role as the JCEO will be. The other one, which is to do with unfair dismissal, and I entirely understand the importance of that to the individuals. But from the council's point of view, is that really about having to pay effectively redundancy costs and any other settlement costs for unfair dismissal? So is one actually trying to appoint on merit for a long-term position, And the other is just concerned about whether you are minimising your payout. And am I right that if one candidate or if both candidates apply and are not appointed, you'll be in the same financial position as if you had simply gone for an external candidate in the first place? So I would be very grateful if we could have complete clarity on whether we're not really comparing apples with apples. It is a choice, as we've been told, but one is dealing with the principle of doing all you can to get the best possible candidate, which could indeed be one of the internal candidates if they've been properly market tested. And the other is simply concerned with how much money you end up paying. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Molnar. No, I haven't got any more speakers. Councillor Follows.
Could I have an answer, please?
Yes, I said, you let me finish. Councillor Follows did say that he would answer that. All I'm asking is, I've got another two hands going up now. So Councillor Follows, if you'd like to answer that now.
I will certainly try my best on the first bit. I wouldn't categorise either of them as not an appointment based on merit, because they still go through the full appointments process. When we do these sorts of things, the other factors which you referred to, for example, the redundancy costs that a council will have to bear, are not things that should properly come into the mind of the people doing the appointment process. Now, if this goes through, you will of course be one of the people making those recommendations. And like me, you will be taking into account what the best candidate for the job needs to do, and applying that regardless of which piece of legislation is given primacy in our thinking process right now. It's still trying to find the best candidate for the job. I just think it's wrong to imply in any way, and apologies if you didn't, but to imply in any way that one is not a based on merit appointment. They still go through the same process. I will just very quickly answer Councillor Elson's question as well. We know what each authority does. They do pretty much the same as us. In fact, actually, Guildford's so close to us because they run their housing stock as well, which makes us quite rare because we both do it and not many councils do anymore. So we know what a joint chief executive needs to lead. And the first few paragraphs of the job description about having that vision and strategic leadership umbrella over the top of what we already know the two councils do makes it very clear now what we know we want a joint chief executive to do. And actually having a full inter-authority agreement already done and dusted would actually deprive that new chief executive of deriving most of the benefit that we actually intend to seek out of this. It would not be putting cart before the horse. It would be wasting a massive opportunity and one of the main benefits of this entire process. Mr. Mayor, if I could now defer to Mr. Maycock if there needs to be further explanation regarding Councillor Molyneux's question.
Mr. Maycock.
Thank you. No, I think the only thing that I absolutely agree with Councillor Follows, neither of these options, as I'm calling them, are not an appointment on merit, because you will go through a full and rigorous process to appoint the best candidate. Just one thing to add in terms of the redundancy and potential unfair dismissal. It's not just a question of if you got this wrong, of paying the redundancy costs. If the case could be made that the dismissal for redundancy had not been undertaken properly, was in fact an unfair dismissal, then there is, because the duty to mitigate, and the provisions of the Employment Rights Act, as I've already explained, there is a potential claim there. And if that case could be made, then of course you're looking at costs. I'm not saying that will happen, but that's the other risk factor, I suppose, I think needs to be considered here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rossman, I think you are next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. There's been statements made like the facts of the case are disturbing. We're not dealing with a case, we're dealing with the potential for going forward with the collaboration agreement. And the recommendation to subclause 1 specifically states that this is the early draft. And in any negotiation, you set out with very, like a skeleton, heads of terms, and you move on from there and put flesh on the bones to end up with an agreement that you can reach. So you have to have a starting point, and the starting point here is the recruitment and the appointment to help drive forward the way this should be going. And I think it's vital that there is an officer appointed who can drive that through and lead to the final heads of terms, which will come back to the council. So we're not driving off a cliff edge here, it's just allowing the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rossman. Councillor Gale.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'm just trying to work out if I've got this correct. South East employers are saying that we can actually choose whether we employ internally or we go external. In which case, shouldn't we go for external as well as letting our current people apply for the position? Because that way we are giving it a more fair, diverse advertising.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Councillor Coburn.
Thank you. As you know, I've been worried about this process from the start, and I would like some reassurance, if I could, from South East employers. Having sort of been involved in various aspects of mergers and things, we always took the staff, the staff were at the centre of the whole thing. And what worries me about the timing of this is when we actually take the staff with us. Because if we don't take the staff with us, then that is when you get your claims. And although in both examples we did much longer due diligence and we had a huge amount of expertise advising us, we still found down the line that there were issues with employment that we hadn't quantified, and that happened on both occasions. And you mentioned a case, and of course the case will come if an employee feels they've been badly done by, whether or not they have, and they can prove it. And of course, if you get a joint claim, then you've got more of a problem. So can you just reassure me that the amount of consultation with staff is appropriate, that we have done that we've done it in the right order, and that we're not going to lay ourselves open to further down the line to even more redundancy pay and perhaps other pay that we haven't factored in. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coburn. Councillor Follow, do you want to answer that?
So I'll just go back to Councillor Gale's question, and I'm sure Ms Maycock can elaborate, but I think it's really a sort of risk management approach in terms of what's the most reasonable course to navigate through this whilst not exposing us to unnecessary risk from an employment law perspective. In terms of Councillor Coburn's point, staff, firstly, at the moment, there's only one member of staff at Waverley potentially impacted here, and one at Guildford, both of which have been kept in the loop with this the whole time. And actually, just going back to the behaviour of our chief executive here, he has also made a lot of effort to engage all members of staff at Waverley about the process as to where it is, even though he's predominantly the one that's impacted. Peter and I also attended a session of all staff that the chief executive hosted to continue that process. So staff are being brought along, very much so, as far as I'm concerned anyway. I think the only distinction I would draw here is consultation with a small c with staff versus consultation with a big C, the legal requirement as part of this process. And obviously small c consultation has been happening continuously, and big C consultation would be started by the passing of these resolutions this evening. I hope I've got that correct, Mr Maycock, but if you're able to clarify.
Absolutely nothing to add, but that's exactly right, yes.
Yeah, Councillor Follows. Now I have Councillor Martin, who has spoken before. Otherwise, I see no more hands. So Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, for allowing me to come back. I'm sorry to go on about the process for the appointment of the Joint Chief Executive, but I would just like to make one further point. My intent or my hope is that we will get the right and best Chief Executive out of this process. My concern is that perhaps we won't. Consider this: if we go and interview one or two of the internal candidates, we may come to the conclusion that they're not the right people. We don't really know, because we won't have an external comparison to be able to make. We may then say, all right, we're not going to appoint either of the two chief executives that we have today, and therefore we will go to an external process. We may then go to an external process, which may then throw up the point that actually one of the two existing chief executives were in fact the best people to appoint. But it's too late, because they will have gone away. They probably won't be a part of that second process. So that we will have missed the chance to have the best chief executive. The only way you can get this sorted properly is to open it up immediately to both the internal candidates and the external candidates, so that we can then have a proper ability to compare and contrast, and then to ensure that we have the right chief executive, which may well be one of the internal people, but we don't know unless we have that external comparison. That's the point that I simply want to make. I cannot believe that the process that we've got before us is going to be the right one. We may get the right chief executive out of it, but on the other hand, we may not. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. If I could call on Councillor Adams, I believe you had your hand raised. I'm finding it difficult to see you back there, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, obviously, I've listened very carefully to what everybody said about this choosing a new executive. But what say that goes through? Say that we have a new executive, but then this IAA comes up for consideration. And we've spent an hour and a half, I think, just talking about this one topic. There could likely to be some very significant topics in the IAA, which, where Waverley disagrees with Guildford. And so what happens then if we end up not agreeing at all? Does this new chief executive get made redundant?
Thank you, Councillor Adams. Councillor Follows, you want to answer that?
I mean, any negotiation has the possibility of ending in failure. That possibility does not mean that you don't walk in the room or even start. So from my point of view, the joint chief executive is part of this, but not all of it. It doesn't unravel the chief executive appointment if we don't come to a conclusion on the IAA. I suspect because the people at Guildford are like us in a situation where we've got to find money that we don't have because the government won't give us any, they will be compelled to come to the table in a reasonable way, just as they have done at every single part of this process so far. So I'm sure it's not going to be easy. In fact, I could sit here and do some quotes about how this is going to be the easiest negotiation in history or something like that. I could have a good time with that, but I'm not. I think it's going to be quite difficult because they're difficult subjects. But last time I checked, we were elected here to do the difficult things, not to just do the easy things. And that's why we're here. So that, from my point of view, is where we'll get to. In terms of Councillor Martin's point, I'm going to try not to paraphrase a planning committee too much about each application being judged on its merit. My understanding is that when we review candidates, they're reviewed against the criteria and their ability to deliver the job based on their qualifications and experience. They are not weighed up against the other candidates standing next to them in the room. We don't pick the least bad candidate out of the 5 that turned up. We could easily dismiss all of them for not meeting the criteria. So the idea that we are not assessing a candidate properly against the criteria because we haven't got 5 other people in the room to effectively shill for them and compare them is not logical or sensible. The thing I would just add in here is that my understanding is that we will get training provided by South East Employers, all of the Joint Appointments Committee, because we will honestly need that, because none of us here have got experience of hiring lots of people in serious local government positions. Even if, I mean, in my case, I've gone through this process on both ends of the spectrum half a dozen times in the last 10 years, but I know that that experience will vary greatly across members of the council in general and of the employment committee. So we will obviously do our best to make sure that everybody is properly equipped to follow the law and also make a good decision. And of course, that recommendation will come back to all of you anyway. So if it's something that you think is mad, you can throw it out because that's your duty and your job. So from my point of view, this is a fair process. It is a legal process. It is one that manages our risk. It is one that delivers the best candidate if we are up to the job of actually doing the job properly. All of us on the appointment committee have appointed tonight. And there are criteria for who we're trying to employ here. And that governs all, not just because they're better than the person they're sitting next to.
Thank you, Councillor Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think there is a degree of confusion about what is fairly standard recruitment practice and recruitment practice within the public sector that certainly I've been involved with for a number of years throughout my career. We are talking here about a new post of joint chief executive. It is different from, but not unrelated to, the existing posts that exist within both Waverley and Guildford of a chief executive and managing director. And employment protection legislation, I think, has been pointed out, means that a new post must be offered or should be offered from within the existing pool of available staff at risk. And it is very clear that the basis of that recruitment process is one of a match with the requirements of the post, the new post of Joint Chief Executive. Several councillors have asked, why not go straight to external recruitment? By doing so, we would be in violation, in my opinion, of employment protection legislation. But the answer to the question is essentially that we will go straight to external recruitment should neither of the candidates meet the requirements of the new post. And so I think it is actually quite simple what we are talking about. We are talking about standard recruitment practice to secure a candidate who is appropriate to the job that is being advertised. And, you know, it is significant that we've had this discussion tonight. You know, we had the debate about the significant economic benefits and the economies of scale that arise from closer working. This is a necessary first step to that. And I believe that there are also additional opportunities of collaborative working that can be promulgated once we have a joint chief executive. And I would urge that we move forward in terms of that process along the lines that have been proposed this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I've just seen Councillor Gale put her hand up. Councillor Gale.
Sorry, just quickly, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Williams has just said that we couldn't advertise externally immediately. We have to only advertise to the incumbents. Is that actually correct? I gathered from the South East gentleman earlier that you could actually do either or. Perhaps I'm wrong.
On a point of clarification, I said we shouldn't rather than couldn't. And I was referring to employment protection legislation.
Mr. Maycock, can you clarify?
Yes, that is correct. You shouldn't go. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, Councillor, could you just repeat your question for me? Sorry.
Yes, I was under the impression that you could do either or. You could either advertise the position externally as well as take the incumbents into the advertising, the interviewing process as well, or you could just limit yourself to the incumbents. But I thought Councillor Williams was implying that if we just went externally, we were not doing the right thing.
I don't think that is what Councillor Williams said, and Councillor Lynch will have to clarify if necessary. Thank you. Yes, you could, as I've said before, but the view of this paper written by Jennifer and one which I share is that the recommended option would be to go through for internal recruitment in the first instance, simply purely because or chiefly because of the risks inherent in not doing so, with the potential for unfair dismissal because of not following the recruitment provisions of the Employment Rights Act.
Thank you.
Councillor Hunt.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just want to add, for my opinion, for what it's worth. I've spent the last 2 decades recruiting solidly for large blue chip global companies. For what it's worth, Amazon, Johnson & Johnson, American Express, etc. In this situation, in my experience, having hired thousands of people into those organizations, if you have a reorg and there is one position and you have two internal candidates who could be considered for that position, and one of them or both of them are likely to be made or possibly to be made redundant, you have to go through that internal process first before you then go and advertise to the external market, right? So in my view, for what it's worth, take it or leave it, based on my experience, is that those individuals who are internal need to be considered for that post first before the role is advertised externally. Candidates typically, as a best practice, I would suggest, are not benchmarked against each other, as has already been mentioned. They are benchmarked against the competencies and behaviors that are required for that role that has been properly scoped out by the organization. So it doesn't matter in actual fact whether you have one candidate or 5 candidates or 20 candidates. You are not comparing candidate against candidate. You are assessing candidate against position. Take it or leave it. That's just based on my experience. And I would suggest that's what we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hunt. Now, I don't believe I've got any more hands up. It is 8 o'clock. Can I just ask one of the officers, does Waverley remain open at this time, or have members no longer access to Waverley at 8 o'clock? Is it locked up, or can we get in? The only reason I ask, of course, is that we're over here, and I spoke to somebody over there who wasn't aware what time we would finish. If members have left anything behind, they may not have done. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, may I be indulged and ask Councillor Hunt a question, because I found his contribution very, very, very interesting. And the question is this: that if more than one candidate meets the benchmark, do you then start comparing candidates with candidates, or is he saying that the moment one candidate meets the benchmark, you then immediately appoint? So if you could clarify that, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, so you have your, and I think there's one in this pack, a framework.
Can I just ask councillors if they'd come through me, please?
All right, sorry.
One moment. Right, I'm going to ask Dan Bainbridge to answer that question, please.
Sorry, but it probably wouldn't be fair for Councillor Hunt to answer that question. It's a question that an officer really should give you, Councillor Mulliner. So the answer to that question is if 2 candidates both meet the criteria within the job description, and like Councillor Hunt, I've interviewed many people in this authority, then it's the candidate that best meet the criteria. That's the answer to that question. I'm sure that's what Councillor Hunt would have said, but I think it's more appropriate if an officer answers.
If I'm allowed to say that, then yes, I agree.
Thank you, Councillor Hunt. Are there any other questions? If not, then I'll ask Councillor Follows to sum up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, can I say thank you to everybody for such a constructive debate? I mean, that was a very complex subject with lots of legal nuance and problems and all the rest of it. And I think we got through that in a civil, reasonable way, in a way that I hope left us all more comfortable with what we're about to do, whilst remembering, of course, the reasons why we have to do it. Councillor Hunt, I think, summed up absolutely where I stand on this. That is exactly the process by which I understand we need to follow. To do other things, yes, is possible. Yes, it's a choice, but it is a choice that comes with risks that are usually unacceptable to most organisations to do. That is why we have made that particular choice. The point regarding best suiting the criteria has also been made in full. I'm not going to rehash the entire debate. I think we've got a lot of the answers that many members were seeking. My request is that members support the process, the progression of our collaboration opportunity through this first step, the appointment of a single joint chief executive for Guildford Borough Council and Waverley Borough Council, and I commend it to you all and thank officers for all of the work that they've done to get us to this point. Thank you.
There are 6 recommendations which will be taken together, bearing in mind the emendation has already been passed.
Apologies,
Indeed,
Mr. Mayor, I
Councillor.
forgot to call for a recorded vote as per the usual administration policy.
For your, if you heard that, Councillor Follows is asking for a recorded vote. Can I have others? That has been supported, so we'll have a recorded vote. Sorry, who said? I can't see everyone, I'm sorry.
Got it. I just want to clarify the ruling that these have to be taken together. I think there is a case for suggesting otherwise, and I'd just like to understand your view on that.
We have already passed the emendation, so I'm quite happy that we do it separately. I don't mind. Councillor Follows.
My understanding was that there was a significant dependency upon each recommendation, which is why they were taken as a block and why they were taken as a block in Guildford as well.
Oh, well, if they were taken as a block in Guildford, what choice do we get?
The reasons, Councillor
Okay,
Costa, are
thank
the same
you.
regardless of where they are.
Thank you very much. We have, thank you, Councillor Costa.
So
We
can I
have now,
possibly suggest, Mr. Mayor, one
Sorry,
compromise?
Councillor
which
Mulliner, I'm sorry,
is to
I'm having
take-
difficulty seeing you. If you could just say your name first. Councillor Mulliner.
Yes, a compromise I might suggest is to take 2 on its own and then do 3 to 6 together.
I'd be happy with that.
Follows.
Councillor Mulliner, could you please explain how the Joint Appointments Committee will do anything if it doesn't have a job description from which to appoint it, as outlined in number 2, and all of the rest of it that goes with it? They're dependent on each other.
I will be happy to explain. I think some of us have concerns about 2D, despite what's been said, and the rest, though, are much more in the way of admin.
I think at the moment we'll take all 6. So in that case, it either falls or goes through. Now, this is going to be a recorded vote. So if I could ask Louise to carry out the roll call, please. This is for all 6 as laid out in your papers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillors, when I call your name, please confirm whether you wish to vote for, vote against or abstain. Councillor Adams.
Against.
Councillor Baker. For. Councillor Beeman.
For.
Councillor Blishen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Coburn.
Against.
Councillor Costa.
Against.
Councillor Darcy.
For.
Councillor Davidson.
For.
Councillor Dixon. For. Councillor Ellis. Against. Councillor David Else.
Against.
Councillor Jenny Else.
Against.
Councillor Floyd Douglas.
Against.
Councillor Follows.
For.
Councillor Forrest-Esky.
Against.
Councillor Gale. For. Councillor Goodridge.
Against.
Councillor Gray.
Against.
Councillor Hegan. For. Councillor Henry.
Against.
Councillor Howard.
Against.
Councillor Hunt. Councillor Hyman.
Against.
Councillor Isherwood.
Against.
Councillor Knowles. Oh, sorry, apologies. Councillor MacLeod.
For.
Councillor Penny Marriott. Councillor Peter Marriott.
For.
Councillor Peter Martin.
Against.
Councillor Merriweather.
For.
Councillor Mirrlees.
For.
Councillor Mulliner.
Against.
Councillor Neal.
For.
Councillor Nicholson. Councillor Palmer.
For.
Councillor Potts.
Against.
Councillor Reid.
For.
Councillor Rivers.
For.
Councillor, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Rabini.
For.
Councillor Rossman. For. Councillor Sadler.
Against, and my name's spelt wrong, by the way.
Apologies. Deputy Mayor, Councillor Ward.
For.
Councillor Wicks.
For.
Councillor Williams.
For.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's 26 votes in for, 18 against and no abstentions.
In that case, the motion is carried. Thank you. In that case, there are no further matters being considered, and therefore the meeting is concluded. And I'd like to thank you all, as the leader said, for a good discussion and taken in the proper manner. And we've come to a result on this. Thank you very much indeed. Good night, and we've finished.